There is a window in Chartres Cathedral, 8 meters above the nave floor, depicting a shoemaker at his bench. He's rendered in cobalt glass, each piece cut to the size of a thumbnail, cold to the touch, set into lead channels no wider than a finger. The shoemaker's eye is a single blue fragment. His awl hand is 3 pieces, leaded together. The whole figure is smaller than your forearm. Below him, other members of his trade. Beside him, a butcher at his block, a baker with dough. Guild after guild, trade after trade. 42 windows across the nave and ambulatory, each showing the people who funded them, at their labor, in the glass. You cannot read any of their faces from the floor. 8 meters is roughly the height of a 3-story building. The figures are the size of a hand. To identify the shoemaker as a shoemaker, you need to already know what you're looking at. Or you need the kind of magnification that nobody in 1215 owned. And yet the window was paid for. The glass was commissioned, designed, cut, assembled, and installed at a cost that would have represented months of income for the guild that funded it. Someone made a transaction. Someone decided this was worth doing. So why would you pay to have your portrait placed somewhere no one can see it? The same decade these windows were going in, a city 40 miles northeast was being asked to fund a cathedral of its own. The archbishop levied a tithe. The city refused. The archbishop ordered the population confined to their parishes. The city rioted, killed one of his officials, and drove the cathedral chapter out of town. It took a papal intervention to get the building finished. That city was Reims. The building is still there, and if cathedrals were community acts of faith, built by willing people reaching toward God together, then something about that sequence doesn't fit. Communities don't require papal interventions to complete acts of devotion they chose. The word cathedral comes from the Latin cathedra. It does not mean what you think it means. And if you look up what it actually means, and then look at these buildings again, the story you were told about why they exist starts to come apart. If you enjoy these stories, then support the channel by liking and subscribing. Thank you. The accepted version goes like this. Medieval cathedrals were acts of collective devotion. Communities pooled their resources. Nobles donated stone rites. Merchants funded windows. Bishops organized campaigns. Craft guilds contributed labor. And over generations, sometimes centuries, raised buildings that expressed the faith of an entire city reaching toward God. The height was spiritual aspiration, made physical. The light was theology in glass. The scale was the community's own ambition for its relationship with heaven. This version is not fabricated. It contains real things that happened. It is also, in its essentials, a story the buildings themselves contradict. If you look at where the money came from, where it went, and what got built when the funding stopped. Thomas of Chobham was a subdean of Salisbury Cathedral around 1215. He wrote a manual for confessors, a practical guide for priests administering penance. It covered merchants, laborers, usurers, wherein the moral status of their various trades. He included a section on the fundraising instruments used to build cathedrals. He was not a reformer. He was not a rebel. He was a working cleric writing a practical document, and he wrote plainly that the financial mechanisms behind cathedral construction placed both buyer and seller in a state of moral compromise, regardless of what the money built. He was writing in Salisbury while its cathedral spire was rising. He knew what the stones cost. He set it down in plain language, in a manual that circulated among confessors for a generation before disappearing into the archive. His name appears once in the secondary literature on cathedral financing. The first thing to understand about Gothic cathedral construction is that it was a competition, not a metaphor for competition, an explicit, but documented episcopal arms race in which height was the primary unit of prestige, and bishops tracked each other's vaults the way a rival company tracks a market leader's quarterly numbers. Amiens Cathedral reaches 42 meters at its interior vault, 138 feet. That was the record when Amiens finished its nave in the early 13th century, beating Bourges. Beauvais began construction in 1225 under Bishop Milo of Nanteuil. His successor, Bishop Guillaume de Grès, added extra meters to the planned height specifically to surpass Amiens. The Beauvais choir reached 48.5 meters, nearly 160 feet, and became the tallest Gothic vault in Europe. In 1284, a large section of it collapsed. It was rebuilt, and then in 1573, The tower over the crossing fell, and the nave, the part of the cathedral where the congregation was actually supposed to stand, was never built. You can go to Beauvais today and walk into what exists. The choir soars above you, stone ribs fanning out at a height that makes the walls feel like they're leaning inward. The light coming through 13th century glass at an angle that has no floor-level reference point because the floor extends only so far. And then you turn around. Where the nave should begin, there is an exterior wall. Stone, flat, final. The building simply ends. 800 years of unfinished. You walk back out through the transept the same way you came in, because there is nowhere else to go. No Gothic builders attempted to match Beauvais after the collapse. The official explanation is that the failure taught medieval builders the structural limits of the form. The documented record is that every city that tried to build at that scale was simultaneously fighting funding crises, construction halts, and the political consequences of extracting that much wealth from populations that had reached their breaking point. If these buildings were expressions of community faith, the height should track what the community wanted. It doesn't. It tracks what one bishop wanted to say to another bishop 40 miles away. The congregation at Beauvais never asked for a vault that would collapse. They were standing inside someone else's argument. This is not coincidence. This is the shape of the mechanism. The mechanism worked as follows. A bishop wanted a cathedral. The cathedral cost more than any local resource could cover in a single generation. The construction of Reims was once described in a contemporary church document as a financial abyss. So the bishop drew on every available instrument: tithes from the diocese's parish churches, a compulsory percentage of income, not a voluntary contribution, fines levied against clergy for rules violations, fed directly into the building fund, relic tours, the bones or possessions of a saint transported to neighboring towns, pilgrims charged to view them, proceeds returned to the site, and indulgences, documents issued by the church for money that reduced the buyer's time in purgatory after death. Not metaphorical documents, printed writs, signed and sealed, handed over in exchange for coin at market stalls and cathedral doors across Europe. The Rouen Cathedral Butter Tower earned its name because it was funded by selling indulgences that permitted buyers to use butter during Lent. Not a metaphor. The tower is still called that. The fundraising instrument that sparked Martin Luther's 95 Theses, the sale of indulgences to fund St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, was functionally identical to the instruments used to finance every major cathedral built in the 3 preceding centuries. Luther called it a corruption. The mechanism itself was not new. It was the design. Thomas of Chabot sat in Salisbury and wrote it down with the flat precision of someone documenting what he already knew. The man who paid for an indulgence to reduce his purgatorial suffering while funding a cathedral nave was not, in Chobham's analysis, participating in an act of faith. He was participating in a transaction. The building would stand. The soul's account was less certain. Go back to the question the shoemaker raises. Why would you pay to have your portrait placed somewhere no one can see it? The extraction mechanism just described answers that. You didn't choose to pay. The tithe was compulsory. The indulgence was sold at the cathedral door. The portrait in the glass was not your commission. It was the receipt the building issued for what had already been taken. If you've made it this far, you now know more than 99% of people who have ever walked into one of these buildings. In 1210, the existing cathedral at Reims burned. Rebuilding began in 1211. The campaign was enormous. Reims was the coronation city of the French kings, the seat of the archbishop, a project with political as well as religious stakes. By 1213, with the upper levels growing more expensive and donations slowing, the archbishop organized a public ceremony. The cranium of St. Nicasius carried through the city streets to prompt renewed giving. By 1221, indulgences were offered. By 1233, the archbishop levied a direct tithe on the city's burghers. The burghers of Reims refused to pay. In retaliation, the archbishop ordered them confined to their parishes. They attacked his house. They killed one of his officials. They harassed the cathedral canons in the streets. The chapter abandoned the city for 3 years. It took Pope Gregory IX and King Louis IX to restore order. When the chapter returned in 1236, the 7-spire project was quietly removed from the plans. The 2-tower silhouette standing in Reims today is the architectural record of a funding revolt. Historian Barbara Abu El-Hajj documented the economic consequence. The extraction was so sustained that Reims's urban growth was stunted well into the early modern period. Cities that built comparable cathedrals without triggering revolt did not grow faster. They simply extracted more quietly. The construction of Reims Cathedral did not enrich the city that built it. It impoverished it. A community building its own act of faith does not require a pope and a king to finish it. The moment that intervention was necessary, when the highest authorities in Europe had to compel continued funding, the story of collective devotion had already ended. What remained was collection. I would now go back to Chartres and look at the windows again. Specifically, at what art historian Jane Welch Williams argued in 1987 when she challenged the standard reading of the trade windows. The traditional view, the shoemakers, the butchers, the bakers donated their windows as an act of civic pride, their portraits preserved in the glass as a record of their generosity. Williams's counter-reading, the images of docile laborers depicted in donor position, were the anxious projections of an ecclesiastical class managing difficult local politics, a visual argument that the working population was willing and grateful, placed in a building whose construction that same population was frequently coerced into funding. The further problem, scholarship has not been able to confirm that the shoemakers of Chartres in 1215 were even organized into a guild capable of raising the funds a window required. The depiction may have preceded the organization it purports to document. You can pull up a photograph of Bay 44, the shoemaker window, right now. Count how many panels show the tradesmen at work. Then count how many panels of biblical narrative sit above them. Then find the shoemaker's face. Note where it sits in the frame. What is not disputed? The king's coat of arms is visible from anywhere in the building. The bishop's throne is at floor level, carved in stone, at the east end of the nave. The shoemaker's face is 8 meters up, in glass cut to the size of a thumb. The archbishop sits where he can be seen. The shoemaker sits where he cannot. Both are inside the same building. Only one of them chose where the other one went. That is not a detail about medieval art. It is the system's logic made visible in a single window. The portrait was the institution's claim that generosity had occurred. Placed somewhere, the donor could never verify it from where he stood. This is the conflict the hook opened. The community's act of faith required a riot to finance in Reims because the community was not the author of the project. The community was the instrument. The cathedral was the bishop's project, the bishop's competition with the diocese across the valley, the bishop's height record, the bishop's seat at the end of the nave. And the community was the funding mechanism. The windows were the receipt. Your portrait in the glass was proof the transaction had occurred, that you had given what was asked, that your face had been placed in God's house, just not anywhere you could read it from where you stood. That pattern, the community as instrument, the portrait as receipt, holds across every cathedral built in the same century. At Bourges, at Amiens, at Toledo, the fabric rolls that survive show the same structure. Episcopal ambition sets the scope, extraction mechanisms fund it. The workers who paid are placed in the glass at a height that makes their presence symbolic rather than visible. The community's name is on the building. The community's money is in the walls. The community's faces are in the windows. But the community didn't decide what got built, how tall it would go, or which diocese it was meant to surpass. Here's what the word actually means. Cathedra means throne, not house of God, not church. The throne seat of the bishop, the carved stone chair at the liturgical east end, at floor level, facing the congregation. Every cathedral in Europe is named after that chair, and the building is designed around it. The nave, the long body where the congregation stands, comes from the Latin navis, meaning ship. The bishop sits at the east end. The congregation faces the bishop. Every column, every arch, every sightline in the structure draws the eye toward the throne at the far end. The flying buttresses that hold the ceiling up are on the outside of the building. From inside, you cannot see what is holding the structure together. What you see is uninterrupted height, colored light, and a man in a chair at the end of it. That is not an accident of engineering. That is a design visual experience. The engineering, the pointed arch, the rib vault, the external buttress, was developed to serve that effect, not the other way around. The theology of height arrived after the ambition to build higher than the bishop one valley over. The word encoding the purpose was always in the name. None of it was hidden. The word was in the name from the first stone. What changed was only the story told about what it meant. And that story required the community to be the author of a building the community was made to pay for, rioted against finishing, and was never permitted to see their own faces in from where they stood. We walk into these buildings and call them churches. The builders left the word right there in the stone for anyone who cared to read it. The physical evidence has never been hidden. The throne is still at floor level at the east end of every cathedral in Europe. Beauvais is still unfinished. The Reims spires are still missing. The Chartres windows are still too high to read without assistance. The structures preserve the record perfectly. What changed was the story told about them. The word cathedra became cathedral. The throne became a church. The tithes became community effort. The indulgences became shared devotion. The riot at Reims, documented in a 2008 academic journal, absent from every tourist leaflet printed in the last century, became a construction delay. The stunted Reims skyline became an architectural evolution. The shoemaker 8 meters off the floor became evidence of medieval civic participation. 3 buildings, 3 documented patterns. In Chartres, donors painted at a height where they cannot be identified from the floor. In a building whose financing remains disputed in the scholarship, funded through instruments a working theologian of the period identified as moral compromise. In Reims, a tithe that triggered a revolt that reshaped the building's silhouette, and an extraction that stunted a city for 2 centuries. In Beauvais, a bishop who added height to a vault specifically to beat a rival diocese, and a collapse the city is still sitting inside of 800 years later, unfinished. The official story is that these buildings were expressions of faith. The documented record is that they were instruments of competition, extraction, and institutional power, dressed in the language of devotion, sure and named from the beginning after the seat of the man who held the power. Those 2 things cannot both be true in the same way. Thomas of Chabot named the transaction in 1215 in plain language, while the Chartres nave was going up and Salisbury's spire was rising above him. He knew what the stones cost. He knew what the indulgences were. He set it down. The manual circulated for a generation, and then it went into the archive. His name surfaced once in a footnote in a scholarly study that most people will never read. The throne is still at the east end of the building. The shoemaker is still in the glass, 8 meters up, too small to read and too high to see. The word is still in the name. The building told you what it was. It put the throne in the title. We just stopped looking at what the word meant.